It's been another day of dire warnings from top experts. In testimony planned for a House subcommittee tomorrow, Dr. Rick Bright, he's the guy who said he was removed from his job as head of the federal agency that was working on a coronavirus vaccine because he pushed back on the president's touting of hydroxychloroquine for widespread use. He's warning that 2020, quote, will be the darkest winter in modern history if the U.S. does not develop a national coordinated response based in science and fast. Fed Chair Jerome Powell is also warning of long-lasting economic damage and is all but begging Congress and the White House to push through more aid to soften the blow of what he calls the biggest shock our economy has felt in modern times.
Almost 40% of those in households making less than $40,000 a year had lost a job in March. This reversal of economic fortune has caused a level of pain that is hard to capture in words. While we're all affected, the burden has fallen most heavily on those least able to bear it.
Of course, it's not just the economic impact that's disproportionately hitting people. It's the physical effects of the virus, too. And one of the most at-risk groups are prisoners. Back in early April, our state's highest court ruled that pretrial detainees not charged with violent offenses, as well as those held on technical probation and parole violations, could get hearings to determine whether they could be released due to what the court called the urgent and unprecedented situation. But according to an amicus letter sent last week by Suffolk County DA Rachael Rollins and State Rep John Santiago, seeking the release of more prisoners who don't pose a threat to the public, since that ruling was made, the prisoner population has fallen by just 5.6%, while the number of people who've tested positive for coronavirus is up 485% in those facilities. It's a striking statistic to hear, especially on the day former Trump campaign chair Paul Manafort was released from prison 4 years early, by the way, due to coronavirus concerns, despite there not being a single confirmed case at his prison and the fact that he doesn't meet the list of criteria for release. I'm joined now by DA Rachael Rollins and State Rep John Santiago, who's also an emergency room physician at Boston Medical Center. Good to see you both. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
DA, can I start with you for a second? I mentioned a minute ago the SJC made it easier for nonviolent offenders to be released in early April, but you think they didn't go far enough. Where should they go and why?
Jim, the decision you're speaking of really pertains mostly to pretrial detainees. Right. Another word to use is innocent people. They have been found guilty of nothing yet. Where we are encouraging the Department of Corrections and the governor to be even more expeditious in their process or expedient is the post-conviction sentenced individuals, right? The Manaforts of the world who have either served most of their sentence and are at a heightened risk, we would argue, for contracting COVID-19.
Well, he actually hasn't served most of his sentence. We'll get back to him in a minute. Representative, if I can address you for a second, is part of the concern you have or part of the argument that you and the DA have is that even if they wanted to, the prisons in the state couldn't effectively practice physical distancing to keep the inmates well? Is that part of the case?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the district attorney would agree. I mean, we as a society, I think, are judged by how we treat our most vulnerable communities. And if we cannot return to a place where the death penalty is, for all intents and purposes, reinstated as a result of COVID-19, and this is not about whether you're soft or hard on crime. This is about whether we believe in justice in all of its form. Because if you look at COVID-19 from a medical perspective, it doesn't respect rules, right? It only knows survival through transmission, and the overcrowding of prisons and jails really allow the virus to spread. And so we think these conditions put inmates and the staff at risk, and therefore we should be releasing inmates.
I guess it depends on how you define justice, too, District Attorney. My sense is that when I look at the kinds of people that you believe should be released from prison and what they're charged with, but they've been convicted for, they're the kinds of people who you don't think belong in prison to begin with, even if there was no COVID-19. Is that not true?
Yeah, some of them. But I also want to make sure for the people that are listening, this isn't just about prisoners, right? We look at our veterans' homes. We look at our nursing homes and assisted living facilities. These are locations where the very nature of how you are housed is problematic regarding the flattening of the curve, extreme hygiene, and social distancing. But you were right, Jim. With respect to those pretrial detainees, many of them, I want them held because they're dangerous, not because they're poor. They have not been found guilty. They are innocent, and they are going to a place where the likelihood of them contracting COVID-19 is exponentially higher than if they were in the community.
By the way, Representative, do you agree with the DA that the bulk of the people you're talking about and the court was talking about in early April shouldn't be in prison to begin with?
No, I agree with the DA, and she's exactly right. I mean, it's about, do people have the privilege to self-isolate through quarantine, right? You know, as a society, we sought to implement these CDC guidelines with respect to social distancing. And you and I and the DA have these privileges, but you can't tell a homeless person to self-isolate quarantine. And likewise, you can't tell a prisoner in a jail setting to do that as well.
But if they shouldn't be in prison to begin with, COVID-19 or not, and I'm directing this to you, Representative, isn't that an issue for the legislature to fix rather than a court? Why don't you change the laws about who should be in prison pending a trial?
Well, there is some legislation that has been put forward to address this issue, and many of us have signed on to this as well. But right now, the governor has the power to really extend clemency in some cases, to really make the parole board move forward and release folks as well.
Is the parole board acting more expeditiously, Representative? Because my understanding was this original SJC decision, they were urging the parole board to essentially speed it up. They may not have used those words, but that was the message I got.
I think that was the legal term they used. No, I will jump in. I know the representative can answer this, but what I will say is, after a strong admonishment by our Supreme Judicial Court, Commissioner Mici, as well as Secretary Turco, have really stepped up the process. Okay. I wrote a letter, Jim, to Governor Baker on April 29th, asking him to also use his power of pardon and other powers that the governor has that we've seen. For example, Attorney General Barr recently used that power with Michael Flynn. And we've seen other things happening there. So we need an all hands on deck right now, Jim, regarding these issues.
I want to stay with you just for a second here. I think most people know that there's one particular person who was released where you objected in both the trial court and the SJC. Disagree with you. This William Utley, who was charged, I think, with second-degree murder and a firearm thing. Very quickly, if you can, why should he? He hadn't been tried either. Just you said he was still innocent of the charge. Why should he not have been released?
I'm aware of that. What I believe is Mr. Utley had a firearm case back in 2016, and then in 2018, while out on a GPS bracelet and an $8,500 bail, we argue committed a homicide and then also got his 5th OUI. I argue that even though he had not been found guilty of any of those 3 crimes yet, his behavior showed us that he was not able to comport with the requirements of safety in our society, and we fought. My hope, Jim, is that Mr. Utley is going to be complying with all laws and is not going to be a problem with us, but we fought on behalf of the people of Suffolk County to keep them safe.
Does either of you, by the way, I mentioned Paul Manafort before. If we didn't know who he was and we just listened to the criteria you two are concerned about, he's not a violent offender. He had no prior record. He hasn't served a significant period of time. Some might argue he's not out because of that. He's out because he's a friend of the President of the United States. Should he, based on your criteria, be spending the rest of his 4 year sentence at home confinement, starting with you, Representative?
Well, I think if he fulfills the criteria, he should definitely be released. But it's important to state that, I hope he's not the only one. I hope that the same criteria is done the same for Black and brown communities alike as well. And my concern is with Paul Manafort is that, I don't know, I can't state what's going on in that respective state or with that individual, but I just hope that the same privileges are being extended to Black and brown communities in jail.
I want to skip this with you, DA, because I want to go to a more serious matter than Paul Manafort, if I can. You have spoken about the fact that this is 2 other constituencies I want to address with both of you. You've mentioned the fact that you're disturbed by the fact that the number of calls reporting child abuse and neglect has gone down. Why are you concerned, and what's the fix for this problem?
Well, I'm concerned because we know, Jim, that with respect to domestic violence and child abuse and neglect, what we have here is the highest unemployment rate since the Depression. We have increased, foreclosures and evictions. We have people losing their jobs, and all of those pressures don't bode well for domestic violence and child abuse and neglect. Last year, during March 1st to May 12th, our Child Advocacy Center had 526 calls. During the same time during this year, we've only had 339. It's a 36% depreciation.
What are you going to do about it?
We are making sure that we're on the internet. We're letting every school know that as they're zooming into people's homes, they need to be looking for the same things they would be seeing if those young people were walking into school with them. Jim, we're proud that we've had 23 forensic interviews virtually with young people that are survivors of sexual assault. We are adapting, Jim. We are not saying that we can't help you. We're sorry. We're in a global pandemic. We need to make sure we're offering services and treatment to those vulnerable because the harm is still happening.
Representative, the DA just mentioned evictions and foreclosures, and I know you're a big supporter of putting a moratorium on that, which the legislature and the governor did. Did they go far enough in your estimation? Quickly, if you can.
Well, I think we did. I think we were one of the first and had the strongest moratorium across the whole country with respect to evictions and foreclosures, and I'm very proud of the work that the House leadership did on this.
Well, last thing for both of you, starting with you, Representative. I'm going to be joined by a colleague of yours in a couple of minutes whose whole family has been suffered from COVID-19. She has voiced some concern about whether or not we're reopening too soon, particularly in communities of color and things like that. I've seen you speak about some positive trends. I know the mayor reported today no deaths in the last 24 hours because of this in the city. Is Governor Baker on the right timetable in your estimation, starting to reopen, it appears, next Monday?
Well, let's put it in context. Because of our strict social distancing across the Commonwealth, we've been able to withstand the surge. Now we're on this plateau, and this plateau is going to last a very long time. Now, with respect to the number of infections that have decreased in hospitalizations, we are headed in the right direction. Make no mistake, today we had about 14% positive rate, but my concern is that is still a bit too high, that we're going to have to get into single digits before we even consider opening up the economy. Because to be frank with you, if we were to have a second peak, that could be worse, that could be more devastating, and that could result in more deaths. Are
you as cautious, DA, as the representative is about the opening, at least the beginning scheduled on Monday, I guess?
Well, firstly, I want to send my well wishes to Representative Liz Miranda, who you're going to have on, and all of her family. I am, and I had a senior staff meeting with my staff. I have about 350 employees that we're responsible for in the DA's office, and my staff is concerned about returning to work too quickly. So, look, the governor has a very hard job. We'll all be watching to make sure that we are safe. But, Jim, when communities like Chelsea and Revere are in the top 6 places in Massachusetts that have the highest rates of positives for COVID-19, and we see these disparities in who's dying and who's not getting ventilators. And I appreciate you, Representative Santiago, for speaking out about making sure there's representation on those committees in hospitals determining who is going to get those ventilators, and there's going to be equity in treatment. But, Jim, I have a lot of concerns, and we'll be watching with a watchful eye.
Rachael, Rollins, John Santiago, thanks as always to both of you. I appreciate it.
Be well.
Thanks.